Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, the Army's premier research library, archives, and an outstanding museum. The center is a component of the U.S. Army War College and is located up in Carlisle Barracks. Its research center is available for the public's use, and we encourage you to visit the center, or as more and more of the manuscript collection is placed online in digital format, visit their website to research on the history of the U.S. Army and its soldiers. Tonight, we're very pleased to host Professor William C. Davis. He has had a distinguished career as a historian and as an educator. A graduate of Sonoma State University, he was most recently a professor of history at Virginia Tech and the executive director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. Specializing in the American Civil War, Professor Davis has written more than 50 books on the American Civil War and other aspects for early Southern U.S. history. He is the only four-time winner of the Jefferson Davis Prize for Confederate History and was awarded the Jules and Francis Landry Award for Southern History. His book, The Lost Cause, Myth and Realities of the Confederacy, provides a critical examination of the myth of the lost cause, and Lone Star Rising has been called the best one-volume history of the Texas Revolution yet written. For many years, he was the editor and publisher of Civil War Times Illustrated, and his expertise on Confederate and Southern history has made him a valued consultant, especially for the Arts and Entertainment Network History Channel series, Civil War Journal. Professor Davis, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry. I'm delighted to be with you all. It's very kind of you to take an hour out of your time this evening to come and listen to an old historian talk about what he loves to talk about best, which is Civil War documents. And it's especially pleasing for me to be doing this with the Army Center there. I spent many years living just about 15 miles north of Carlisle and spent a lot of time down there, have a great interest in the collection that's been built there. So I'm delighted to have been asked to speak to you all. What I'm going to talk about in large part is one of the luckiest sorts of things that a historian can deal with, and that is that occasionally when you're looking for material, you may just strike gold. I've been lucky that it's happened to me several times. And most recently, it was in the finding of the Civil War letters of General Gabriel Wharton of the Confederate Army and his wife, Nannie Wharton. No one knew those letters existed. I had hunted for them years ago when I was doing a book about the Battle of Newmarket, Virginia. I tried to track down descendants of all of the commanders of brigades and regiments on both sides in the hopes that members of the family might still have personal papers relating to that era. And I found quite a bit. But when I wrote to the grandson of General Wharton, who was still living in the General Wharton's house down here in Radford, Virginia, I got a very kind letter back from him saying he would be delighted to help. But unfortunately, there were no family papers in existence. At that time, he didn't know that 2 floors above him in his own attic, there was a steamer trunk and 15 boxes of his grandfather's papers from the Civil War before and after. An incredible trove of material that no one in the family apparently had ever gone into that attic. When the house was sold in 1988, they finally had to clear out the attic, and then they came across these letters, about which more in a few minutes. And it just through luck and coincidence that I eventually learned about them almost 50 years after I looked for them and was able to edit them into the book that has now come out from UNC Press. Oh, finding something like that for an historian is about as close as a terrestrial being can come to being an astronaut, I think, to having that Christopher Columbus sort of moment of discovery thrill. It's hard to describe the feeling if you haven't felt it yourself. And as I said, I've been lucky enough to run into it several times. A little bit about our protagonists. Gabriel Wharton, born in 1824 in Culpeper, Virginia, comes from an old Whig family and a slaveholding family, and went to private academies, then VMI, where he graduated second in his class. His roommate was later General William Mahone, and the two would have a relationship through most of their lives. After that, he did not go into the Army, but instead he became a civil engineer, working first on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which of course is so important to the Civil War operations of Northern Virginia, and later helping to start the Virginia and Kentucky Railroad, which he was working on in 1861 when Virginia seceded. He immediately took a commission as a major and began working on the defenses of Richmond under the direction of Robert E. Lee. But soon afterward was put in command of a small brigade of southwestern Virginia soldiers that accompanied General John B. Floyd out to help reinforce Fort Donelson. You all know what happened at Fort Donelson. Floyd's troops were virtually the only ones to escape, and Wharton himself and his small brigade escaped and came back to service in Southwest Virginia. By the spring of 1863, he was 39 years old. He was the veteran of 2 or 3 broken romances and pretty well convinced that he was going to spend the rest of his life as a bachelor. And then at the community of Central Depot, it's now called Radford, Virginia, he met Anne Radford. She had been born in 1844. Her father, Dr. John Blair Radford, was the most distinguished citizen of Central Depot, and in fact, the town, of course, is later named for them. She's 19, he's 39. She's also, like him, very well educated in private academies, and she's precocious. There's not saying enough about her. When she was 19, she wrote her autobiography. Consider for yourselves, what would you have to write about at the age of 19? So she's somewhat full of herself, very intelligent, whip smart, opinionated, a bit high strung, a real challenge for any man, I think, but with great rewards if he could manage to learn how to deal with her. They meet at Central Depot, we don't know how, and by February 5th, 1863, they had become engaged. And they began writing their first letters on March 8th, 1863. Thereafter, they wrote 524 letters, all of which survive. Sometimes they wrote every day. Sometimes they wrote 2 or even 3 letters a day. And the interesting thing is, it reveals them as thoroughly 21st century people whom you don't expect to find in the mid-19th century. Anne Radford, who went by the nickname Nannie, is all business. She is as fixed and focused on her purposes as anyone could be. She's tough, she's opinionated, she is not afraid of anything. She weighs all of about 85 pounds. She's very, very tiny. But inside that, though she be small, she was mighty. Gabriel Wharton is exactly the opposite. He's all about feelings. His letters are just full of gushing and mush. He absolutely adores her to the point that he will do anything she wants, anything she says to keep her happy. On one occasion in one of his letters, he even tells her that he realizes that perhaps he hasn't lived up to her ambitions for him, and he would be happy to change his last name to hers and become Gabriel Radford, if that would make her happy. I've never run across that in my life anywhere. They're a truly unusual couple. The interesting thing about these letters, well, first of all, they're not unique, but they are close to it. I've never come across another set of general officers' letters that are this numerous and more to the point. In Civil War correspondences, as many of you will know, the letters from home, from the wife, the mother, the sweetheart, whatever, very often tend not to survive because the soldier, be he a private soldier or a general, carries them around with him from field to field. They ford streams and they get soaked. He reads them and rereads them and folds and unfolds them until they crack and crease and almost fall apart. But what is unusual here is that all of their letters survive, including all of Nannie's, because Gabe, as she called him, had the foresight to send her letters back to her and to tell her to put them together along with his into a book. And in fact, when these letters were found in the attic, they were sewn together sort of artificial books about this high. There were several of them, which kept them all perfectly preserved, even though when they were cleared out of that attic, they went to Florida for a while and sat in a garage with all the Florida heat and humidity and the occasional hurricanes like we're seeing now. It's almost miraculous that they survived, but they did. And in them, you can see the two begin to know each other. It's pretty apparent that they had not been engaged. They were not involved with each other very long before they became engaged. And it's pretty clear that they didn't have a full appreciation each of the other's strengths as well as weaknesses, because these are all revealed in their letters as they write them. Gabe, for instance, was opposed to secession like most Whigs of his time. He was essentially a Unionist with rather strong feelings of attachment to the Union, only he did have, like many Southern Whigs, stronger attachments to his state. But he absolutely despised the fire-eating secessionists and the abolitionist hotheads in the North who brought about the crisis. So he has very little sympathy with, if any, with the people who brought on the war, even though he is willing to risk his life going into the war for the defense of Virginia. Nannie's family are the opposite. They're Southern Democrats, much more conservative at that time than the Whigs, but they too had no use for the hotheads who had created the crisis. And so there's an initial bond there between the two of them, in that they realize this is not a war that they wanted. It's been forced upon them. They have almost no sympathy with the issues that brought it on, but as Southerners, as Virginians, they realize they have to do their part, or so they feel. It's interesting to see how they evolve opinions, how they share opinions with each other. And I'll add, by the way, that these two are so well educated and so well lettered that it almost made it a nightmare at times to edit and annotate their letters for publication, because they're constantly quoting obscure 19th and 18th century Scottish poets that I'd never heard of. And having to track down where these quotations came from was a considerable chore and a learning experience for me. Nannie has no difficulty at all disagreeing with Gabe, which is a little out of the norm for a typical for its time Victorian relationship. As I said earlier on, she's strong-minded. She knows her own mind and she has no hesitation in expressing it. They disagree about commanders from Jefferson Davis on down. Neither really liked Davis, but the degrees of their disagreement are somewhat interesting. Wharton simply says, I do not think Davis is the right man in the right place. He's too stubborn and too mulish to be the leader of a great enterprise like the Confederacy. Nannie doesn't like Davis because he keeps delaying promoting Gabe from colonel to brigadier general. She frankly says that ambition is the driving motivation of my life. She wants to get ahead, and in that era, the way to do that is for her husband to get ahead. So she will constantly be at him in their correspondence to try to strive more, to gain promotion, to gain distinction. While he is a fairly laissez-faire sort of fellow, he's not all that ambitious, and he especially doesn't want to get involved in political wire pulling in Richmond, which a great deal of this went on behalf of several people, hundreds of people trying to gain promotion. Nannie will chide him, if you won't wire pull for yourself, how about pulling a few wires for me, because it will make me happy. They differ also about leading generals, starting with Robert E. Lee. Nannie will frankly say, I do not think Lee is the man his reputation makes him. He has a great name, but he's too cautious for practical revolution. She even says Lee is nothing more than a corporal if compared to Napoleon. Gabe disagrees emphatically. He thinks Lee is the great commander of the war. I would cheerfully agree to his being made king, Wharton will write to his wife, if he was successful. They disagree about Longstreet. Now, Gabe disagrees with lots of people today about Longstreet. He thinks he too is a great commander. They have interesting comments about the department commander in Southwest Virginia, which is where Gabe will spend most of his time in service. The man, his name is General Samuel Jones, who is one of those sort of forgotten figures of the Confederacy. He's a nice man. He's a gentleman. He's very much attached to then Colonel Wharton, but he seems to be slow in pushing his promotion. And when he is relieved of command, neither Gabe nor Nannie are particularly unhappy about it. But then you come to Robert Ransom, the great, from North Carolina, often regarded as probably the greatest martinet in the General Officer Corps of the Confederacy. It's a thoroughly unpleasant man. Gabe comes to hate him, especially after serving directly under him. He'll refer to him as Sir Oracle because Ransom's always issuing these grand pronouncements as if he's the Oracle of Delphi, and referring to Ransom's North Carolina birth. Gabe dubs him his Tarnus from the Tar Heel. Even more, they agree first, then disagree about Jubal Early. Early will take command, as you know, in the valley, the Shenandoah Valley, in the summer of 1862, lead the raid on Washington, and fight 3 unsuccessful battles against Sheridan in the lower Shenandoah. And finally, his army, and what's left of it, is dispersed in Waynesboro in March of 1865. At first, Gabe rather liked Early. He's crusty, he's profane, but he seems to be a fighting general. But then Early starts to do something that tends to define the whole attitude of both Gabe and Nannie toward the Confederacy, and that is he gets in the way of their romance. Early does not like having general officers' wives anywhere near the army, and there's a few around. But he refuses to give Gabe furloughs and leaves of absence to go back to Southwest Virginia to see his wife. Gabriel Wharton's attitude toward Early will shift from admiration in June of 1864 to the point of absolute contempt, if not hatred, when he will say by the fall of 64 that Early, his blood is as cold as that of a fish. He is a man without feeling. My favorite of all the comments in the letters about any general are what Gabe has to say about a general many of you may not have heard of. That's General William L. Jackson, who went by the nickname Mudwall as opposed to Stonewall Jackson. I don't know how he got that appellation. He was a pretty good lower brigadier level officer, but somehow this nickname stuck to him. I doubt that he was very happy with it. But they campaigned somewhat together in Southwest Virginia in 63 and 64. And on one occasion, Gabe had this to say about Mudwall. Writing to Nannie, with whom do you suppose I slept last night? You could never guess in a year, so I will tell you. I had the honor of sleeping with General Mudwall Jackson. It was very late before our wagons came into camp, and the old general and I went into a house and slept finely. We shared a bed, which made me quite uneasy, fearing that in my dreams of you, my precious, I should exhibit too much affection for the old general. But I was very tired and slept soundly and behaved with great propriety. Both of them hate the war. Naturally, virtually everyone on both sides, Mason and Dixon's line, hated the war. Their hatred was heavily personal because of the way it had separated the two of them and kept them apart. And you find something here that I have not seen in other Confederate general officers' papers, and that is their patriotism is pretty conditional. The war is a great inconvenience to their romance, and their dedication to the Confederacy is therefore rather tenuous. As the war looks, as the Confederate cause looks more promising, they seem to feel more attached to it. As its promise wanes, they are less and less patriotic and actually admit it to each other. And then their basic temperaments enter into this. Nannie is by nature a pessimist. It's always going to rain. Nothing can ever be done. Things will always go wrong, and no one can be trusted. This is kind of her approach to life. Gabe is the original Pangloss and Macabre out of David Copperfield. He always thinks things are going to turn out for the best. He trusts everyone, often unwisely. And he always comes to rest again and again on his notion that everything will work out for the best. His optimism drives Nannie nuts at times, and she protests against it. He remains optimistic right up nearly to the end of the war. But then they discuss what should they do if the Confederacy should be defeated. If the cause is unsuccessful, do they stay in Virginia? Do they stay in the South? No, they talk about leaving, getting on a vessel and sailing to England or South America or to Europe to start over somewhere else. Well, of course, this happened with about 10,000 ex-Confederates after Appomattox did go south or abroad. Virtually all of them came back home in time. So this idea is not unique to them. What is interesting is that more and more in 1864, they talk about not waiting for the end of the war. They're sick and tired of being separated from each other. This war has been a huge impediment to their romance. And Gabe frankly says, if things don't look better, I should resign my commission and we'll get on a blockade runner and we'll go to England. We'll go to Europe. We'll go someplace or other else where we can start anew in a new place and leave behind us this ravaged and virtually defeated land. Because of where he served, virtually all of the war in Virginia, except for going to Fort Donelson, Gabe saw firsthand the devastation visited on a state that he loved, and especially in the area around Culpeper, where he had born, where he grew up, where he still had family. By the way, he had a sister who married a man whose last name was Mitchell. He was a captain. Captain Mitchell had a granddaughter, Margaret Mitchell. So Gabe Wharton is sort of the uncle of Rhett Butler and all of the crowd from Gone with the Wind. He doesn't resign, of course, but it's a topic they discuss frequently. And then something arises shortly after they get married that is really going to put some strains on them. Nannie thinks she's pregnant. Gabe is delighted. He's ecstatic. He wants nothing more than to have children. Nannie is terrified. Remember, I mentioned how tiny she is. I think I said she only weighs about 80 to 85 pounds. Her waist is not much bigger around than that. This is an era in which she will know a number of women who have died in childbirth. The idea of going through childbirth absolutely terrifies her. And she expresses this terror repeatedly and repeatedly in her letters to him. And he keeps trying to calm her, to ease her anxiety, and of course keeps telling her everything will work out for the best. Well, what happens is it was a false alarm. And the letter that she writes to him is poignant and funny at the same time. She actually sort of makes a joke. They were by naming it Little Radford. And then she writes Gabriel a letter saying, little Radford is no more. He's gone. And she says, really, it's quite funny. I thought I was pregnant. I was mistaken. The usual things that I'd missed for a month came back, and all is better. I don't think Gabe really expressed how he felt about that in his letters in response on that. But what he does say, which is kind of interesting, is that he's so sorry that he put her through that. He felt almost total responsibility. And of course, he played a part. And then he promises her, I will never put you in such a position again. Now, how he proposed to do that, short of remaining celibate for the rest of their marriage, I don't know. But whatever the case, the resolution didn't last that long. They had a brief visit in the fall of 1863, and lo and behold, Nannie is genuinely pregnant for good. And you can almost see her mood spiral downward as she contemplates more and more what she's about to face. First of all, the physical changes in herself. She becomes essentially a recluse and stays in her bedroom. This is not altogether unusual. Women who were expecting in that era very often secluded themselves until after the birth of the child. She talks repeatedly about her ugliness, about her discomfort, how she's ashamed for anyone to see her, even her own family. It's really quite touching. And as she gets bigger, it gets worse. And the morning sickness, and then the discomfort of this tiny person carrying this growing fetus is almost heartbreaking to see her fears and her anticipation. And she talks about the fear of the dread ordeal she will have to go through. She knows it's coming, and she's convinced that she will not survive it herself. On one occasion, she wrote to Gabe when she's about 9 months, she's 9 months pregnant. It's about 2 weeks before she gave birth. I feel like I was sitting on a volcano that's about to explode. Now, of course, I have never gone through childbirth or been pregnant, but that sounds to me like a pretty good definition of what it must feel like sitting on a volcano. He promised again and again that he would be with her when the time came, but unfortunately, the baby was delivered June 11, 1864, and Gabe wasn't there because he was with Early, off on the raid to Washington and then in the lower Shenandoah. And of course, Early would not give him a furlough or leave to go home to see Nannie. So Gabe, in fact, never gets to see his son for months after his son was born. That was a very active year for Wharton in the field. He's commanding a brigade, later a division, a small division. He commands a brigade at Newmarket, of course, in May of 1864. His brigade is shifted east to join Lee at Cold Harbor. They're there again in the north and South Anna. Then he gets sent back to the valley along with Early to go on the raid to Washington and the battles at Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek. Throughout all of that, he's desperately trying to get back to see his wife and to see his son. And at the same time, he is looking after Nannie's brother, John Radford. She's already lost one brother, Willie, killed at Williamsburg in 1862. She dotes upon her other older brother, John Radford, who's now a major in the cavalry. And Gabe tries to keep him close as much as he can to protect him. But unfortunately, John Radford is detached, his unit's detached in Northern Virginia, and he is mortally wounded. And Gabe, it takes a long time to find out about it. And when he does, he then goes through this long, lengthy process of trying to get custody of the remains because they're behind enemy lines. General Sheridan, in fact, will allow John Radford's body to be sent south. But still, it's a heartbreaking several weeks as the family has to go through the ordeal of trying to get their dead son's body back to them. All of this plays this enormous impact on Nannie's attitudes toward virtually everything, but particularly the ambition. She, as I said before, she's very ambitious. At one point, she says that, the driving force in my life is ambition. By late 1864, having gone through that childbirth and labor, which she never fully recovered from, having lost her brother, but having lost both brothers now, having seen the ravages of the war on her husband, who's lost weight, he's not well much of the time, and she will write to him that all ambition has been washed away by scalding tears. After Waynesboro, when Early's army, a small army, essentially fell apart, Gabe came back to Southwest Virginia with the remnants of the division he was commanding and had no orders other than to sort of hold their ground in Southwest Virginia. And of course, in April comes Lee's surrender at Appomattox. It's evident that the war is over in Virginia, and certainly in Southwest Virginia. And Gabe just sort of hangs around. And at least finally he and Nannie are able to be together during those odd weeks until finally on June 20th, 1865, he'll go to Lynchburg, Virginia, where there's a Union headquarters, and give his parole. He wrote to Nannie that day that this is my last day as a Confederate officer. I feel right blue at the idea. But that done, he came back home. There the letters end, but of course their story does not end. For all that they were not that prominent during the war, Gabe and Nannie become civic leaders of considerable import in Southwest Virginia following the war. He accepts the war's outcome entirely, including the abolition of slavery. He knew slavery was dead before the war was over, in fact. But they see a ravaged landscape. They see a people beaten up, impoverished, scarred, and impacted in so many ways by the hardships of war that they decide to set out rebuilding their region. At first, Gabe goes back into railroading. There are still railroads that need to be built, because one thing he has seen, and it's in his letters during the war, he's stationed in some remote areas of Southwest Virginia that weren't very well settled, to which there wasn't easy access, certainly no rail access. But he's seen the rich mineral resources, coal, iron, and other minerals in the ground. He sees the power available in the New River and its tributaries for waterborne power, as well as for waterborne transportation. There's timber in abundance to be taken advantage of for rebuilding. And so step by step, issue after issue, he goes about trying to rebuild the region. He starts a railroad himself. It fails. He starts building his own town to be called New River, right across the New River from Radford. It is going to be a town that is industrially fully integrated. He's going to build a railroad to the town. The town will have a sawmill. It's to have a steam mill. It'll have a railroad station. He builds a hotel that's still standing, and several other accommodations around for rental or lease to people to attract them to come to the town of New River to help draw on these mineral resources in Southwest Virginia, to get them via railroad to markets in the east, to factories in the east, for the prosperity of all of the state, but particularly in Southwest Virginia. As I said, that doesn't succeed, but interestingly enough, virtually every enterprise that he starts and fails at, someone else comes along right after him and does the same thing and is able to make it succeed. At the same time, they tried developing the town of Central Depot, which, as I said, will later become Radford, Virginia. Gabe builds a hotel there, which also doubles as a county courthouse. It's still standing. He builds Nannie a house called Glencoe in 1876, built out of brick, made right on the site. The house still stands. It's now a civic museum and gallery. He employs people who were formerly the enslaved people belonging to Nannie's family as farmers and co-workers on their own farm. In fact, For a time, they all share the same house. And shortly afterward, the Whartons are living right next door on their property to the black families who are now working for them. One of those black families is particularly interesting, and they appear throughout the letters during the war. The man's name is Tim Lewis. He's about 25. The woman's name is Emmeline Pate. Tim Lewis accompanies Gabe to the front, so he's sort of his camp servant. Emmeline is the personal body servant of Nannie, helping her dress and whatever else. And of course, throughout all the pregnancy and the raising of their infant son. At some point, Tim and Emmeline become enamored of each other. And thereafter, in almost every single letter between Gabe and Nannie, they're each sending messages of love from Tim to Emmeline and from Emmeline to Tim. And both are actively rather matchmaking this couple. Now, as I expect you probably know, in Virginia, at least during the war, slave marriages had no standing in law. They will later acquire standing by a legislative fiat after the war. So Tim and Emmeline go through some kind of a wedding ceremony, but then Tim goes back off to war with Gabe. And something interesting happens that I have never encountered anywhere. In the fall of 1864, Tim begins to seem discontented. He may fall in with some evil companions. We don't know for sure. But Gabe Wharton begins to hear rumors that his man, Tim, may be thinking of trying to run away to the Yankees, abandoning his wife, abandoning other family members who were also enslaved by the Radford family, and abandoning, presumably, his duties as camp servant. So instead of chastising him or punishing him or sending him back to Central Depot, General Wharton calls Tim into his headquarters and confronts him with this. And Tim, of course, is embarrassed that he denies that he really was ever going to do that. But then the general says to him, look, Tim, if you are thinking about running away to the Yankees, don't do it in some sort of clandestine manner. Tell me you want to go, and I'll give you a horse, and I'll give you money and passes to get you through the lines safely so you can leave as a man with your head held high. I've never encountered another example of a Confederate general offering to help an enslaved person run away to the Yankees. Well, Tim and Emmeline lived next door to the Whartons for some time. And then Nannie goes to work. She inherits a lot of property when her father dies. And she becomes a property developer. She lays it out in plats and begins to sell plots for homes. She builds some homes and either rents them or sells them. And it's an integrated community. There are Black people living right next to white people in this Eastern Radford community. Not content with that, they start a newspaper, and Nannie is the editor of the newspaper, in which she writes the editorials on American foreign policy abroad and that sort of thing. When money gets tight, as it often is, because Gabe was great at the ideas, but not really great at business, he actually takes a job with the Department of the Interior as a land agent out in the area that was at one time known as the Gadsden Purchase and elsewhere. And off and on will spend several years in the New Mexico Territory and Southern California, which he loves. He's very successful at that. He sends the money back home while Nannie takes care of the business affairs. And it's an interesting, at times difficult, at times challenging relationship, but somehow or other their mutual love for each other and their love for their son, Willie, keeps them together. Sadly, as I mentioned some time ago, Nannie's health is never good after the birth of their son. She becomes increasingly irritable. She's in pain much of the time. Chances are very good that the act of carrying the fetus may have done some damage to internal organs. And in 1888, she'll die aged just 44 years old. Gabe was at her side. In fact, he was lying at the bed right next to her in their home, holding her hand as she died. And the first thing he did was to sit down with his diary and write a description of his feelings. It's, as many times as I've read it, it's still heartbreaking to read what he wrote. But somehow he soldiers on. And amongst all the other things that he's doing after the war, he becomes a champion of education. He's elected to the Virginia State Senate and is there in 1873. He's chiefly responsible for shepherding the Morrill College Land Grant Act. Land, I think you're all aware that in 1863, land was set aside in all of the Western states, public land, to be given to each state to sell, to raise money to promote education. And it was up to the states to designate which university or which college was to receive the land grant land. There were several competitors for it in Virginia, but Gabe had a fondness for what was called the Olin and Preston Institute in Blacksburg, Virginia. And he, with the help of his friend Mahone, who is now in the House of Representatives in the Virginia legislature, he gets the land grant land for the Olin and Preston Institute, which will become, of course, Virginia Tech. He's the first rector, in fact, of the Board of Visitors of Virginia Tech, and thereafter takes a great deal of interest in it and pride in it. He'll take part in Confederate veterans affairs, going to some conventions here and there, but he happily avoids the temptation to be like his old nemesis Early, and doesn't get involved in all the controversies between generals over who was responsible for which defeat. He doesn't fight against the result of the war. He accepts it, and apparently there is no bitterness, whatever. He forms friendships with some prominent former Yankees, one of them being future President James Garfield, who actually passes, and also future President Rutherford Hayes, both of whom will pass through the Central Depot, and Gabe will entertain them as guests. His later years are relatively happy with his son and relatively happy with Nannie's family around him and the friends they've made over the years. He never got rich. He never had any ambitions realized, such as Nannie had hoped to see realized. But he was a much beloved citizen of Southwest Virginia when he died in 1906, one of the last living Confederate generals from Virginia. And none of this was known until somebody went up in that attic in that house in 1988. And there's still much more besides just the letters that they wrote. He was an extensive diarist. In fact, he today might be called a hoarder. He never threw anything away. And amongst all the letters, there are 3 of his toothbrushes that he carried around during the war. There's the shirt that he wore at his son's wedding. There's a small, crusty, almost brittle remnant of a flower that Nannie gave him on their wedding day that he kept every day thereafter. The sentimentality of the man is wonderful. Along with it, something of a sense of humor. He remembered the names of the room numbers of every hotel they stayed in when they went on their honeymoon. First to Atlanta, where they stayed in room number 41, and then on down to Charleston, where they even toured Fort Sumter for a while he was on furlough for his marriage. And every year on the anniversary of their marriage, if he wrote her a letter, he'd put in there a little line, something to the effect of, "Do you remember room 41? So he's a bit of a scamp as well. What else remains there is for the history of education in Virginia, for the history of the old Southwest, for the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, because Gabe was involved in surveying before the war, one of the routes for the Transcontinental Railroad. He had a remarkable service and a great breadth of experience, of much interest indeed. The book that I and the Wharton's great-great-granddaughter, Sue Bell, edited is just the letters, and it's only really about half of them. University Press economics being what they are, they couldn't publish all of the letters in entirety. But fortunately, we were able to cut out a good bit of just plain old mush, because Gabe would go on at length about how much he loved Nannie. And after a while, a little of that could get kind of old. But still, there's much more in those letters to be found, especially about the means and modes of expression of feeling between people in that age. They're far more restrained than we tend to be today. They're far more formalized in the way they expressed emotion and affection. And it's very, very interesting to have this light to be able to pry in perhaps to their personal life and see how these two people found love and kept it alive, even as the world they had known was collapsing around them. It was a great pleasure and a privilege to be given a window on the lives they lived and the war that they happily outlived. And I think that's enough, perhaps, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Okay. I would ask you if you have questions for Professor Davis, that you go ahead and use the question and answer icon at the bottom of the page or at the top of the page, depending on what Zoom variety you're using. As an individual tied with an archivist, an archival facility, where are those papers these days? And two, what conditions were they in when you found them?
The papers currently are all in the hands of the Wharton's great-great-granddaughter, Sue Bell. She got them from the garage in Florida, where they've been kept for some time, saw the potential of them, saw the potential they held, and got them all up to her home in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Their condition is wonderful. It's amazing considering all the years they spent in an attic in a house that undoubtedly had mice and who knows what else. It's even more amazing they survived Florida winters and Florida summers for any number of years. She got interested enough to start transcribing them, and then realized that it would be helpful for her to have the counsel and participation of a professional historian. Sue is not trained as an historian, but she exhibits all of the natural instincts of an historian. She's an excellent co-editor. And so she, through a variety of people, managed to contact me. And I was delighted to become involved, because after almost 50 years, these letters I'd looked for once had suddenly fallen into my lap. It took us about 3 years to do all the transcription and the editing. I am in hopes, and Sue, I think, is amenable, that the war letters, at least, may be placed in the archive or special collections at Virginia Tech. It's a natural place, since Nannie's from this area, since Gabe was the father of Virginia Tech in some ways. Where all the other papers might wind up, I don't know, but ideally at Virginia Tech as well.
Yes, we always want to promote our own facilities, don't we?
But of course, yes,
But
indeed.
of course. Anybody else have questions? Please, if you do, hit the question and answer icon. Have you found it? There we go. This question's from Charles. Charles wants to know, where are these two buried? And I actually know Charles was assigned at Virginia Tech.
Okay, that's my old friend Chuck. Hi, Chuck. How you doing?
Yep, that's Chuck.
And say hello to Rosemary. Yep, Chuck Payne. They're both buried in a small plot with Nannie's two brothers killed in the war, and with her parents. And I think their son Willie is buried there. It's an odd thing. No one really knows who this little plot belongs to. It's sort of between two driveways, one homeowner's driveway, to get to this little infenced area where they are. It's a peaceful little spot at times, except that right over the edge of the fence is the high school football field. So on Friday nights, it's pretty loud there.
Okay. Well, Chuck's glad to see you. Matter of fact, he was the one who encouraged me to reach out to you. He now works with me here at the Heritage Center. So we're pretty lucky to have stolen him from Virginia Tech.
Good. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Any other questions, please? Professor Davis, that's it amongst questions. Do you have any closing remarks?
Only to thank you again for inviting me to participate. I've enjoyed it. And I have nothing but the highest regard for your institution there. And you go look in the archives, you'll find a huge numbers. And I started back in the 1980s with all the stuff that came in the days over the transom when I was at the magazine. And that's what started to convince me that probably every old house in the South, someplace in the attic or shoebox, in a chiffon robe or in an old dresser, has got more letters and more things like this. It's wonderful to see it coming out. That's why I was always able to look forward to the mail every day.
That's myself, the same experience. Oops, we may have another question here. Let's see. Just everybody's very happy with your presentation. They're not asking questions. They're giving you praise for your talk. Well, thank you for doing this. When I first reached out to you, you said you wanted to talk about these letters. I was a little bit surprised, considering your other books, but it was a very interesting and good presentation because it shows a different aspect of people's lives during the Civil War. For those of you who would like to come back, we're going to have another presentation on the 29th of November at 7 p.m. We're going to jump into the 21st century. The talk will be Black Hearts and Painted Guns, a battalion's journey into the Iraq Triangle of Death with Colonel Retired Dan Morgan and Kelly Eads. So